John's account moves about 100 miles north to the hill country of Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus first called the disciples to follow him. We pass back over old territory through Samaria and Jacob's well, where we met this Samaritan woman. The scene of the feeding of the 5,000 takes place on the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, near Bethsaida. Verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. After these things shows an indiscriminate amount of time has passed. It may be some months later. A massive crowd is now following the Lord. He goes over the Sea of Galilee. He's preaching to the huge crowds from a small boat in the shallow waters. Verse 2. Then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. Eliot's commentary says of the great multitude that John the Baptist had been killed, so his followers would have been following Christ. Also, the 12 disciples were on home territory. All were Galileans, except Judas. They would have returned with wondrous tales of Jesus' exploits. Jesus is performing miracle healings. These also draw huge crowds eager to be healed and to witness the miracles. They are called signs, and they are signs pointing to his divinity. Verse 3. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Jesus moves upward on the mountain, moving our attention upward with him. From up here, the disciples must have seen the many thousands of people streaming in along the roads and footpaths, following the signs leading them upwards to their King on the hilltop. Verse 4. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. The Passover suggests that large numbers would be on the move from the hill country towards Jerusalem. Little do they know they're in for a feast right enough. Verse 5. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, Where shall we buy bread that these may eat? The events of this miracle are covered in all 4 Gospels, from which we can gain a fuller account. We read in Mark's Gospel, for instance, that the people come out of the towns to see him, and that Jesus had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. What a scene it must have been to look down upon these massive crowds. And Jesus asked Philip where they could buy bread to feed these thousands. Where would you buy that amount of bread for that amount of people? You would struggle today, even surrounded by shops and supermarkets, to get bread for thousands. Verse 6, but this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Augustine considers this verse and distinguishes between 2 types of temptation. One that punishes men for sins, and one for proving and exercising them in accordance with the Lord's compassion. Through Christ we are in a relationship with God. He prompts and leads us towards him as our provider, rather than ourselves, providing for ourselves. I can imagine Jesus asking Philip with a wry look as he knows exactly what he's about to do. Verse 7, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. Even after the chapter 5 revelation of his deity, Philip does not think for a second that Jesus could produce food from nothing. He reveals our common materialist mindset. We do not look to God to provide. We frantically count up the cost as we tremble before the material obstacles. Verse 8 and 9. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? Alongside John, our gospel writer, Andrew was the first to follow Jesus, and he takes an active, obedient role in the Lord's service. Here in chapter 5, Andrew interrupts with a comment about a small bundle of bread and fish. The tone in which Andrew asks this is open to interpretation. I've heard preachers who say that Andrew shot himself in the foot by adding, "But what are they among so many?" I sense more that Andrew was led by the Spirit. I mean, even asking the question, "What are these among so many?" means that Andrew knew this was a paltry amount that could barely feed a few people, never mind thousands. So why even bother mentioning it? It would be an uncharacteristically exasperated outburst of sarcasm. Rather, I think something deeper impelled him to notice this. Unless it was just more materially minded defeatism in line with Philip. Either way, Andrew's action contrasts Philip's hesitancy, and Jesus now has the raw materials of the miracle. Verse 10, Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. So John's account numbers 5,000 men, and we know from the other Gospels that women and children were present too. So in total there were perhaps 10,000 people, even 20,000 plus, some have supposed. Let's say 10,000 to be conservative. The other Gospels also tell us that Jesus had the disciples arrange the people into groups of 50 and hundreds. Mark's Gospel in the Greek describes them laid out like flower beds in a garden. That's such a beautiful image. And it sounds like one that would have impressed itself upon the mind of someone looking at this. And the garden imagery takes us back to the Garden of Eden. It must have been some sight for the disciples to behold this hill covered in people, circling downwards and outwards from the Lord on the peak. Verse 11, And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. It's amazing to think of the scene. The bread and fish being carried in baskets down the mountain, working its way down through all of the flock from the highest to the lowest. With God at the apex of our people, we are all provided for in abundance. And it's fascinating to think what it actually looked like up there next to Jesus as he keeps producing more food from nothing. He's already told us he's equal with the Father. He created a universe. He can create something from nothing as he pleases. But to us, it's a grand miracle. I think of it in a modern environment and imagine it like a pizza, let's say. Jesus has this pizza in its pizza box, and out of it comes slice after slice after slice, without the pizza ever diminishing. Truly a miracle. Verses 12 and 13, So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. The disciples filled up 12 baskets with the surplus that fell from Jesus' hands. There may be some message in here about the abundance of the Lord's provision for his own people. Supporting this, we have the 12 baskets for the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 disciples of the Lord. Before the miracle happened, the disciples could not see past the material limits of the situation, but were taught a lesson in the Son's equality with the Father in the most spectacular fashion. Philip, who provided that initial voice of humanist doubt before the miracle, must have felt quite foolish in his previous assumptions. He has learned the lesson. He was tempted in. You know, in Augustine's second sense of temptation, to teach you, to mature you in your journey and your faith. It's a voice of encouragement for when we think we are being tested in some way. It's for our betterment. And while we don't understand things in the time of our confusion, it becomes apparent later when we look back and see the glorious hand of the Lord at play. Verse 14. Then these men, when they had seen the signs that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." All that saw this miracle believed this was the Messiah, the promised one sent to redeem Eden's curse. Even the great prophet Moses did not effect a miracle of that magnitude. In his time, the Israelites were fed by manna, bread from the sky, given by the grace of God above. But here the food is coming out of the hands of the prophet himself. This must be the very prophet that Moses spoke of in Deuteronomy 18, the one greater than himself. Verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Jesus, in his divine omniscience, knows their thoughts and intentions. And see how that crowd mentality works. The Lord just gave them a lesson in how he is in control of all things, and the crowd want to take control of him. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, John told us the Passover feast was near. They would like to carry him into Jerusalem as the Messiah of their own making. But Jesus has other plans. He goes back to the mountain, this time alone. Presumably the action had moved downhill as the day progressed. And think about how Jesus, at the peak of this earthly jubilation, retires to be alone with the Father. And Luke's Gospel tells us he went to pray. His response is contrasted by the crowd, who, despite witnessing copious amounts of food appearing from the Lord's hands, look again to the human will and human desire for secular power, caught up in the excitement of crowning their king in an epic political spectacle. They are not following Jesus. If they were, they would likewise have retired to pray. It's interesting, this tension. When the numbers around Jesus swell up, the swollen numbers seem like a success, yet it brings with it a failure on the part of so many to follow Jesus instead of their own desires, their own vision of what the movement should be. Some commenters suggest that Jesus had came to this hill in the first place to pray, but the gathering multitude led to the miracle feeding, born of compassion. It's beautiful to think of all that divine power in the Lord, diverted from prayer into this mighty miracle, born of compassion for a people scattered in spirit. And at the end of this section, following the excitement of that great miracle, Jesus is alone on the mountain. And how quiet it must be up there after the commotion of the day. The great press of people wanting to seize Jesus by force, and his solitary return to the hilltop adds a dark tone to the end of the section. And you sense a disappointment in Jesus for how the people responded to his sign of divinity.